It was one of those nights when Istanbul refused to sleep. The streets buzzed with life, laughter spilled from cafes, and the Bosphorus shimmered under the faint glow of the moon. But for Demet Özdemir, the city felt muted, almost distant, as if every sound around her belonged to another world. She stood by the window of her dimly lit apartment, the silence inside contrasting painfully with the noise outside. Her phone rested on the table, face down, as though even the glow of a message would be too much to bear. For days, she had been avoiding him. Or maybe, she admitted to herself, she had been avoiding the truth. The tension between her and Yaman was no longer something either of them could pretend away. It lingered in the way they looked at each other when the cameras stopped rolling, in the pauses of conversations, in the long silences when their words dried up but their eyes screamed everything they refused to admit. That night, Demet told herself she needed space. She dimmed the lights, closed her curtains halfway, and tried to disappear into the safety of her solitude. But solitude rarely offered comfort when your heart refused to let go. Her mind kept replaying their last meeting, the way he had looked at her, serious, almost pleading. And then, his silence that hurt more than any words could. Suddenly, a faint knock echoed through the corridor of her building. At first, she thought she imagined it. But then came another, deliberate and soft. Her heart raced. She hesitated, frozen by the possibility of who it might be. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she walked toward the door. Before she could reach it, a voice cut through the darkness. Demet. It was barely more than a whisper, but it struck her like a thunderclap. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him. She didn't need to see him to know, his voice carried a weight only her heart recognized. In the dark, he whispered my name. She would later recall, and in that moment, I froze. Every instinct screamed for her to open the door, to let him in, to end the torment of unanswered questions. But fear, of what he might say, of what she might feel, held her in place. She leaned against the wall, her hands trembling, as his shadow shifted faintly under the doorframe. He didn't knock again. He didn't speak again. Just that one whisper, loaded with everything left unsaid between them. And Demet, with her back pressed to the wall and her eyes burning with unshed tears, stayed frozen, caught between the safety of silence and the danger of love that had never truly ended. For Yaman, that night was the culmination of weeks of torment. He had rehearsed 100 different speeches in his mind, thought of 1,000 ways to explain what weighed on his heart. Yet when he finally stood outside Demet's door, all he could manage was her name. Just her name, whispered in the dark like a secret he could no longer keep. He hadn't planned it this way. In fact, he had promised himself not to disturb her. But as he walked through the narrow streets of Cihangir, his thoughts had dragged him here, step by step, until he found himself staring at her door. He had seen her lights on, a faint shadow moving behind the curtain, and something inside him broke. He couldn't keep the silence any longer. Inside, Demet was trembling. That single whisper carried a storm of emotions. It wasn't just a sound, it was a memory, a confession, a plea. She could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the unspoken regret, the longing that matched her own. But fear rooted her to the spot. What if opening the door meant reopening wounds she had tried so hard to close? What if letting him in meant losing herself all over again? Her mind raced back to the night everything had shattered. The night when harsh words were spoken, when both of them had chosen pride over love. She remembered standing in the same apartment, her voice breaking as she said, "We can't go on like this." And his silence, his refusal to fight for her, had been louder than anything else. Since then, the silence had grown between them, a chasm neither dared to cross. But now, he was here. He had crossed it. He was standing just inches away, separated only by a wooden door and her fear. Can's hand hovered over the door for a moment, as if tempted to knock again. But he didn't. He knew Demet well enough to understand that forcing his way in would only push her further away. Instead, he leaned closer, his forehead brushing the cool wood, and whispered again, so softly that it was almost a sigh. "I shouldn't be here, but I had to." Demet's eyes filled with tears. Her body begged her to move, to open the door, to run into his arms. Yet she stood frozen, her hand pressed over her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. She wanted to scream his name, to tell him she still loved him, but the weight of everything unsaid held her captive. Minutes passed like hours. Outside, Ken waited, his heart pounding, hoping for a sign, any sign, that she would let him back in. But none came. The silence on the other side of the door was unbearable. Finally, with a heavy heart, he stepped back. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, each one pulling him further away, each one slicing deeper into her soul. Demet slid to the floor, her back against the wall, tears spilling freely now. She had frozen in the moment she should have acted. And as his steps faded into the night, she realized the cruel truth: sometimes the words that are never spoken hurt more than the ones that are. The city outside was still alive, but for Demet, everything had gone silent the moment his footsteps disappeared down the stairwell. She sat on the cold floor of her apartment, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, her tears blurring the faint light that filtered through the window. The whisper of her name still echoed in her ears, haunting and tender, like a melody she both longed for and feared. She kept asking herself, why hadn't she moved? Why hadn't she opened the door? She had dreamed of this moment so many times, imagined him standing there, waiting, ready to bridge the distance that had grown between them. And when it finally happened, when destiny placed him right outside, she froze. Her heart had betrayed her, paralyzed by fear and memory. Meanwhile, Ken walked aimlessly through the quiet streets. His hands buried in his pockets, his head bowed against the chill of the night. Every step felt heavier than the last. He told himself he had done all he could, that if she wanted to see him, she would have opened the door. But deep down, he knew the truth: Demet wasn't indifferent. He had seen the flicker of her shadow, the pause in the light behind her curtain. She was there. She had heard him. And the silence that followed was an answer in itself, a painful, undecipherable answer. He remembered the way things used to be between them. The stolen glances on set, the laughter that came so easily, the quiet moments when words weren't needed because everything was written in their eyes. Back then, the world had seemed simple. But success, distance, pride, all of it had woven walls between them. And now, here they were, two people who had once been inseparable, separated by a single door and 1,000 unsaid words. Demet finally pulled herself up from the floor and stumbled toward the window. She pushed the curtain aside just in time to see his figure vanish into the darkness of the street. Her breath hitched as she pressed her hand against the cold glass. He was leaving again. And once more, she had let him. Her phone buzzed on the table. For a fleeting second, hope surged through her veins. Maybe it was him. Maybe he had decided to break the silence with words she desperately needed. With trembling hands, she picked it up, but it was only a message from a friend, meaningless letters on a glowing screen. She threw the phone back onto the table, frustration spilling out in a choked sob. She whispered into the empty room, as if he could still hear her, "Why didn't I open the door?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. The truth was simple yet cruel: she was afraid. Afraid of admitting that despite everything, she still loved him. Afraid of the intensity of what they shared. Afraid that if she let him in, she would never be able to let him go again. And so, in the darkness of her apartment, Demet remained frozen, not because she didn't feel, but because she felt too much. The night dragged on endlessly. Demet lay on her couch, her eyes wide open, unable to shut out the memory of that whisper. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his silhouette standing outside her door. Every time she tried to breathe, she felt the weight of the silence that had followed. She replayed it all: his voice, her frozen body, the sound of his retreating steps. It was torture, a loop she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Ken found himself wandering without direction, until the city finally led him to the waterfront. He sat on a bench overlooking the Bosphorus, its dark waters mirroring the storm inside him. He lit a cigarette, something he had promised himself he wouldn't do again, but tonight promises didn't matter. Tonight, only one thing mattered, the woman he loved, the woman who had heard him whisper her name but refused to open the door. He wanted to be angry, to convince himself that her silence meant rejection. But anger couldn't live where love still burned so fiercely. Instead, all he felt was regret. Regret for the harsh words he had once spoken, regret for the distance he had allowed to grow, regret for every moment he hadn't fought hard enough to keep her close. Back in her apartment, Demet finally sat upright. She couldn't take it anymore. Her chest felt tight, her heart ached with an intensity she could no longer contain. She reached for her phone again, her thumb hovering over his name in her contacts. It would be so easy, just one tap, one call. She could still catch him, maybe he hadn't gone far. She could still change everything. But her hand trembled. What if he didn't answer? What if he did, and she had no words to give him? The fear of rejection, the fear of vulnerability, it all came rushing back. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered to herself, I can't lose him again. Across the city, Can's phone buzzed once in his pocket. His heart leapt, but when he pulled it out, it was nothing, just another notification, nothing from her. He clenched his jaw, shoving the phone back. He told himself he couldn't wait for something that might never come. Yet deep inside, he prayed. Hours later, the night began to fade, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. Demet hadn't slept. She stood once again by the window, staring out at a city that was waking up, while her soul felt stuck in the night that refused to end. She placed her hand on the glass, whispering words only the dawn could hear. Why does love hurt most in silence? For Can, the sunrise was no less cruel. As the sky brightened, so did the realization that he couldn't keep circling her life like a ghost. If she wanted him, she would open the door, she would call. If not, maybe he had to let go, even if letting go meant tearing himself apart. And so, two hearts that had once beaten in unison began a new day apart, haunted by the same night, the same whisper, and the same unbearable silence. The new day unfolded like any other for the world outside, but for Demet and Can, it felt as though time had stopped the moment their paths had nearly collided. Neither of them could shake the weight of that whisper. For Demet, it echoed in her chest like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. For Can, it clung to his lips like a confession left unfinished. Demet dragged herself through the morning, her eyes swollen from sleeplessness. She went through the motions, coffee, shower, dressing for the day, but everything felt mechanical, empty. Every reflection she caught of herself in the mirror seemed to ask the same question, why didn't you open the door? She wanted to scream, to turn back time, to undo the paralysis that had held her captive. Can, too, couldn't escape the heaviness. His agent called about meetings, scripts, opportunities, things that once would have thrilled him. But his voice was flat, uninterested. He didn't care about offers or headlines. What use was success if it couldn't heal the emptiness inside? What good was fame if it left him more alone than ever? By late afternoon, the universe seemed determined to play its cruel games. Their worlds collided again, not at a door this time, but in the most unexpected of places. Demet walked into a quiet cafe tucked away in Besiktas, hoping for a moment of peace. She had barely ordered her tea when the air shifted. She didn't need to look up to know, he was there. And there he was. Can, seated at a corner table, his phone untouched, his gaze lost in thought. The sight of him, real and so close, sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment, neither moved. The cafe buzzed with casual chatter, but between them hung the silence of last night, heavy and unspoken. Their eyes met. Demet froze again, just as she had at the door. Can's heart skipped, but this time he didn't look away. He held her gaze, his eyes raw, filled with the same longing, the same regret she carried. It was as if the universe was giving them another chance, an unspoken demand to decide whether silence would keep defining them. Demet's hand shook as she clutched her cup. She could hear the whisper of her name replaying in her head, pulling her back into the dark corridor of the night before. Demet. That single word still carried everything. And now, here he was, his lips pressed together, as though one wrong word might shatter them forever. Ken finally stood, slowly, as though every movement weighed a ton. He crossed the room, his eyes never leaving hers. For Demet, each step he took brought a flood of emotions, fear, hope, love, pain, until he was standing right in front of her. The cafe seemed to fade into silence. "Last night," he said softly, his voice carrying the same tremor as his whisper, "I came to you because I couldn't keep it inside anymore." Demet's breath caught. She wanted to answer, but the words tangled in her throat. She remembered how she had frozen, how she had let him walk away. Now, here he was again, giving her a second chance. Would she freeze again, or would she finally open the door that wasn't made of wood this time, but of her own fear? For a moment, neither of them moved. The cafe was alive with the clinking of cups, the low hum of conversations, the faint music drifting from the speakers, but for Can and Demet, it was as though the world had fallen away. Only their eyes mattered, only the silence between them spoke. Demet's fingers tightened around her cup, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She wanted to speak, to tell him she hadn't slept, that his whisper had replayed in her head all night, but fear still gripped her. Fear of what would follow, fear of reopening a wound that had never healed. But Ken couldn't let the moment slip by again. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Demet, I know I hurt you. I know I've been silent when I should have spoken, distant when I should have fought for us. But last night, when I whispered your name, it wasn't just a word. It was everything I've kept buried." Her eyes burned with tears. She remembered standing frozen behind the door, her body refusing to move even as her heart screamed for him. And now, here he was, giving her another chance. She finally managed to speak, her voice trembling. "I heard you. I heard you last night. And I wanted to open the door. But I was afraid that if I let you in, I'd never survive losing you again." His jaw tightened, his eyes glistening with the same vulnerability she had hidden. "You'll never lose me. Not again. Not unless you push me away." The words hit her like a wave, breaking through the walls she had so carefully built. She set her cup down, her hands trembling as she whispered, "I don't want to push you away. I never did." Something shifted in that moment. For the first time in months, they weren't enemies in silence, but two people bearing their hearts. Ken slowly reached out, his hand hovering above hers, giving her the choice. Demet looked at him, at the raw honesty in his eyes, and for once she didn't freeze. She placed her hand in his, letting the warmth of his touch melt the cold fear inside her. Time seemed to pause. The cafe, the people, the noise, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the truth they had both been running from. Ken whispered again, not in the darkness this time, but in the light of day, "Demet," and this time, she didn't freeze. She leaned closer, her voice breaking as she answered, "I'm here." The floodgates opened. Tears streamed down her face, and his thumb brushed them away as if they were precious. For so long, they had been prisoners of pride, of silence, of fear. But now, sitting across from each other with nothing left to hide, they finally allowed themselves to feel what had always been there. Their love hadn't disappeared. It had only been waiting, for courage, for the right moment, for one whispered name in the dark to remind them of what they could never truly let go. Later, Demet would look back on that night, on the whisper that froze her, and realize it hadn't been a sign of weakness. It had been the spark that forced her to confront the truth: love, no matter how painful, was worth facing. And Ken, he would remember the silence behind the door, the crushing steps of walking away, only to be led back to her by fate. He would remember that love had a way of breaking through, even when all seemed lost. Together, in that cafe, in the light of a new day, they chose not to let silence win. They chose each other. And for the first time in what felt like forever, both could finally breathe. Because when he whispered her name this time, she answered,